two sources of morality and religion right now because I'd like to write something about. I found, I think, my niche, who I am, is like metaphysics of morals. Um,
Mm.
so I have a vision for a much larger project in the future of, I guess, work on the metaphysics of morals. But I think I'd like to start with writing at least about outlining Bergson's metaphysics of morals. That's kind of the goal for this summer. But all of this kind of blends is relevant to that. So I'm totally open to do that.
Cool.
We should do a two sources dialogue at some point. That'd be, or yeah, Matt too. Yeah.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, I love that. I haven't read that book since grad school, but I really liked it. This is your first time reading it, right, Pedro?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And yeah, it's what a few things that have stood out to me as well. One, the mysticism is awesome, but how he talks about intelligence, like it's interesting how he talks about intelligence as kind of like introducing the element of free will into
Mhm.
life, which is seems a little different. And just to think about how Plotinus talks about intelligence and how he talks about intelligence
Mhm.
Mm.
is interesting. And the other
Mm.
thing,
Well,
shit.
because intelligence kind of like undermines custom, right?
Yeah, yeah, I find interesting the argument that intelligence inhibits instinct, which is like what keeps ants, socially
Mhm.
connected. But then when a philosopher like Kant says that reason compels you to follow the categorical imperative, you're just kind of reifying reason when really it's that initial impulse that he talks about, that
Mhm.
source, the first source of morality that comes in, and then reason just inhibits itself from inhibiting.
Yeah, the
Um,
resistance to the resistance.
yeah, the resistance to the resistance, and that it's intelligence that introduces that element of free will, and because intelligence is self-centered. And so I think what he has to say about intelligence is very interesting, and I forgot the other thing that I thought was very interesting. So maybe it wasn't that interesting.
Mm.
Probably was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like whereas for Plotinus, the intellect, I mean, the nous is um at some remove from the physical worlds, whereas in Bergson, it's more like the intellect deals exclusively with space,
Mhm.
right? And so it seems like a very different
Yeah, that sounds right.
use of that term where the intellect thinks that matter and spaces are real
Mhm.
and not just a phantasmagoria like
Mhm.
Bergson
Yeah.
describes
Well, and then the like
the sensory world.
interconnected, infinite aspect of the intellect for Plotinus, that you can like take it in an infinite number of ways and keep unpacking from it, and it has all these interconnections. Like Bergson still has that, but it's just memory that does that, right? So he
Uh-huh.
kind of like concedes something to Plotinus, but doesn't want to call it intellect, and has this idea kind of that like, well, because I've been going through Plotinus, and he says these things like vision seeks knowledge and things like that, and Bergson wants to say the opposite, right? That like there's nothing about vision that like lends itself to truth capturing and bestowing the truth. Instead, like vision is prone to false manipulations of things that are useful, cutting
Mm.
things up, seeing things as separate, which isn't actually telling us anything about the reality, right? So, but then, I mean, when you see these like tensions, I feel like you can switch perspectives and see how Plotinus really says the same thing. Because Plotinus will say, like, we need a conversion, right? And we need to like change the way that we perceive. Um,
Mm. So that's a big difference from like Aristotle, for whom vision is the noblest of the senses and super important for metaphysics.
mhm.
Bergson saying no. Does he ever thematize like hearing as just because it seems like
Bergson,
yeah,
definitely. I mean, like the qualitative multiplicity connected to music and like
yeah.
this, and like the sense of rhythm. Rhythm is kind of like the simplest form of duration that we can like
Uh-huh.
use to start thinking about duration. Because right, like the beats happen in moments, but the rhythm necessarily is over the duration. You have to hear
Mm.
multiple beats in order to like live in the rhythm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and I remember the thing that I thought was interesting, Matt, in terms of your interest in evolution. I don't know if you remember from when you read it the first time, the two sources, but he talks about, well, like there's this sort of like compulsory morality that's mainly for social cohesion, the closed morality, the closed society. But
Mhm.
then he talks about, the mystical intuition of a society of all humanity, of um as like I guess that that, I forget exactly the word that he uses, but the society of man, an openness to all of humanity, the open society, as not something that's always been there, but as something that's evolved through these figures, I guess, like saints and Jesus, and for example. And so
Plotinus,
you
he
mentioned,
says. Yeah.
you say Plotinus.
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
Oh,
But
that's
although Plotinus like falls short, but yeah.
I see. Oh yeah, I remember that. I did get to that section. I skipped to it, but
Mhm.
Hmm.
I don't know if that's relevant to your anything you've been thinking about in terms of evolution, in terms of the connection between ethics and evolution. But I don't know. It's something that I thought of you whenever I read him saying that.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely there's aspects of Bergson's account of Plotinus and reading the Enneads too directly that I resist a little bit because it makes it seem like embodied life is just a diminishment, and that there's no positive like moral development that might result from um, the
But
soul taking on,
falling. Yeah.
yeah, falling into the body um, and a more like a picture of the evolution of consciousness, like you would see in two sources and in thinkers like Owen Barfield or Rudolf Steiner, where there is still that understanding of consciousness as something that is a reflection and a turning back of intellect upon itself as a result of like material embodiment. But for Steiner, that material embodiment, where there appears to be a separation between um, the intellect or the I and Steiner sense and the material world, is actually a mm, important source of spiritual growth because it allows us to be free as an individual I.
Mhm.
Um, and we need to overcome that division, that perceived division. And if you think of the material world as having some independent existence, then it's Maya, it's illusion, just like Plotinus would say. But there's like a evolutionary process to move through there, um, to deepen the relationship between spirit and the physical world. And the physical world is not just phantasmagoria. Ultimately, it's like this school for spirit in a sense. I don't get that from Plotinus. I get it as this, matter isn't anything. Don't try to think it. There's nothing to think. It's just the lack of thought, the lack of light. Um, and I feel like that is just a reflection of the ancient mentality. And in our time, like, I think we need a more evolutionary picture, um, and a shift in our moral relationship to the physical world.
Yeah.
Does that does that make sense?
And so what do you how do you see matter then? And what's your positive sense of matter?
That it's like spirit needed a mirror for itself to become conscious. And what Plotinus, or what Bergson says Plotinus calls like a kind of hyper consciousness of just the intellect sort of contemplating itself, that that is not free in the sense that there would be some individuation. And so like in a picture of the evolution of consciousness, the individuation of thought isn't a fall, it's a progression.
Mhm.
And it's actually allowing spirit to evolve too. And so I feel like this more ancient picture that Plotinus is developing is, yeah, more of a sense of a, if I know he has emanation and return and everything, so it's not exactly static. There's some dynamism there, but it's like, yeah, return to the original pre-fallen state rather than a sense of an unfolding drama. And maybe this is just my own modern bias speaking, but I feel like what is alive in Plotinus is the sense of a multi-leveled ontology. But what is not alive, at least for me, is that sense of spiritual uh, attuning to spiritual truth being just a return to some pre-fallen state. I feel like embodiment is morally significant, not just as something to be overcome, but as something to be integrated, I guess.
But maybe it just speaks specifically to the mystical sense of like completeness and fulfillment of every moment of existence, right? Like this kind of Spinoza thing. I mean, I feel like Plotinus is inconsistent and he clearly like cared about people and like tried to do good things in the world. So to me, it feels like a tension in his thinking that we also find like Leibniz wrestling with and trying to, I don't know, come to terms with the idea that like everything just is perfect the way that it already is because of God's like power and majesty and things like that. But that
Yeah.
there, and like we can hold that belief without also, or that knowledge or whatever, without at the same time having to actually not care for things in the world, right?
Right.
And I don't think they're like they've integrated this idea or like made it part of their main philosophy. And I totally agree with Bergson that they've not really understood time or duration, right? Like they've maybe understood time and its relation with eternity in interesting ways, but they haven't understood duration and its relation to morality in general and like moral sentiments. I mean, even the fall implies a kind of duration to it, right? And he talks about tendencies and all of this. So like they're inadvertently giving us things that are like a durational approach, but they haven't been able to like properly integrate it and take it seriously enough.
Yeah. I mean, that right at the beginning of chapter 3, when Bergson talks about how Plato's dialectical approach saw contradiction in sensory things, Plotinus sees contradiction in human affairs.
Yeah.
And, as Bergson says, he regarded many of the things we consider serious or even tragic, such as wars, as mere child's play or jesting. And that we should, almost seems like Plotinus was saying we should turn away from that. That's just theater.
Right.
And the suffering you think you see is just the cry of actors. And you're like,
Yeah. No, I
get
can't agree with that. And Bergson like goes against especially Spinoza on this, and like and says like indignation is an extremely important affect, right? Like being
Yeah.
angered by the violence that you see and like wanting to do something about the fact that they're suffering.
Right. You seem vexed, Pedro. Like,
I'm just thinking about all of this. Honestly, what comes to mind is Nietzsche, because in myself, I feel this tension between the ascetic ideal of, maybe the way for me to align myself with the ultimate calling of what it means to be human is to be a monk, right? Where I just give everything up and, in a sense, relegate my body to focus on my spiritual development. But then, as you were saying, like that might be an ancient prejudice, whatever, ancient Greek or Christian or Buddhist prejudice. And then I always have Nietzsche talking in my ear, and I've been thinking a lot about what a sort of Dionysian mysticism or a kind of a Dionysian update to this would look like, where, there's a celebration of the body in addition to retaining this idea of um, the of mysticism, retaining mysticism, but without the sort of harmful or indignation, or I guess relegation of the body. So I've something that I think there's something to it. I just don't know. I don't know. It's just an intuition for now.
yeah.
because I think Nietzsche maybe goes too far, or maybe I'm just not don't have the strength to go as far as Nietzsche. Maybe I'm still holding on to some ideal of good, or mysticism, that, maybe is just an expression of my own will to power and my impotence. But I do think at the same time, I just really identify with Plotinus and what he has to say about the one, but not so much with his denial of the body and, like you said. And so I'm trying to find a middle way, I think.
Yeah. I mean, Nietzsche's affirmation of the body as the true self in, is that in Zarathustra, I think,
I'm not sure.
is important in this context. But I like the call for a Dionysian form of spirituality, which was already there in the ancient Greek world. Um, and even in Christianity, if you think of the parallels archetypally between Christ and Dionysus. Um, but that's like viewing, I think there's a balance there to be struck, like viewing the body as a vessel of spirit and an expression of spirit rather than just the soul being overcome by like lust for an image that's not real,
Yeah.
but rather the soul trying to enter into deeper relationship via embodiment as a vessel or expression of spirit. Because by becoming individuated, a new kind of relationality becomes possible that wasn't possible for like the ideas in the nous, which are like so inseparably, like internally related to one another, you can't even distinguish one from the other, really.
Yeah.
But when nous through soul becomes embodied and individuated, then all of a sudden it's like the
Densely
ideas can
packed
see each other for
with.
some reason. What's
Love
that?
that too. I was gonna say densely packed with like qualitative differences
Hmm.
and
Yeah, or they can hear each other, maybe.
yeah.
It's better.
Yeah, exactly. With the metaphor that we talked about last time.
Mm.
I think there's like a really bizarre thing that he's doing with the idea of activity and movement and matter, where those like they're not defined in normal ways. They're completely and like very different from Aristotle. And it kind of changes everything in the whole system once like I don't know if you were going through recently the sections on matter, and then there's also the sections on act and potency, and this idea that like, well, first of all, for Aristotle, like normal things have matter that's like the statue has bronze as its matter, right? For Plotinus, that's not the case, other than like in a equivocal sense.
Mm.
Matter is like only prime matter. And for Aristotle, in my reading at least, there is no prime matter. Like the matter of everything is another qualitative reality, right? So like water, we can think is made up of moisture and coolness, right? And the
Right.
moisture is the matter, and the coolness is the form or the active element.
Hmm.
So there's no like lowest level other than like the earth itself within
Right.
material things, and everything's relational and qualitatively rich. But
Mm.
for Plotinus, yeah, you have this like pure matter that cannot be like it's only a privation. For Aristotle, matter and privation are two different things, and like they can be somewhat similar, but um, for Plotinus, it's only a pure privation. And then activity isn't necessarily the kind of activity of like the Stoics, for example. So like you have the logos of an animal, which is like the animating principle within it, making its body have all the organization it has, and like seeing that the processes complete themselves properly and things like that. But you have these activities on the model of light in Aristotle. So light is an entelikeia, but it doesn't like move or change or do anything. And when we see by means of light, it's because the light enacts what is in potential in the colors, and that moves through the medium, but we don't actually perceive the light, and the light is not changed by illuminating things. So that
Mm.
model becomes like his model for thinking activities as impassive, right? Not being changed in any way by the activity that they produce. And I do think we have like aspects of this in Bergson, for example, like in pure memory. Our memories affect our consciousness and they create a coherence within our consciousness. And every time we remember a memory, we change it in some way by making it perspectively available to our consciousness and like produce an image and stuff. But we don't actually change the past, right? The past just stays the way that it is. And Bergson like makes this parallel with both Aristotle on entelikeia and like knowledge and things. Like if I have knowledge but I'm not using it, it exists without being actualized, even though it's completely actual, right? It's not active in any sense, but it can activate thoughts and it can activate a multiplicity of different thoughts, right? The idea of a triangle, I can think of an infinite number of triangles because of that idea. So the ideas and the virtual and memory for Bergson, I think, still operate with some of these forms of causality. But there becomes a point, I guess, in Plotinus, and this will draw this together, like where human behavior becomes through contemplation, by being contemplation, I guess, is impassive activity, right? It's this kind of thing that just abides in what it is and isn't changed by the fact that it's activated or unactivated. It can change other things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
I feel, I guess what my instincts or intuitions that push against what I hear Plotinus saying sometimes might be my appreciation of alchemy in some sense, that like matter is not just a mere nothing, it's actually the matrix of transformation.
mm-hmm.
And
which is the Aristotelian. That's more the Aristotelian. Like matter
mm-hmm.
is the possibility of a bridge between forms. That like you can boil water, it becomes air, right? And that air and wood and all these things can turn into fire.
Yeah, it's like Plato's receptacle kind of
Yeah.
thing, like, that holds all the elemental
Yeah.
potentials.
And it really only exists in the interchange. It's not like its own thing that you can then grab.
Yeah.
And it's not a pre-Socratic beneath everything that is like a stable reality that you could approach on its own. It's kind of the durational quality of nature itself. But with a qualitative reality. So for Aristotle, the matter has potential in it. It doesn't have unlimited potential or unspecific potential. It has very specific, limited potential. It's infinite within a certain perspective, right? Like a stick can be broken at any point on the stick. It has an infinite potential for being broken. Well, that's not a very interesting infinity. It doesn't give us much. In each instance, it's just breaking. It can't, if I break it here, become something random. There's a very determinate quality to matter in the like empirical Aristotelian dynamic approach, which is very different from what Plotinus is saying.
Right.
Yeah.
It's an interesting strategy for the way Bergson frames it, that Plotinus overcomes dualism by just saying that, well, matter really isn't anything. It's all form, or it's image all the way down, or quality all the way down, like you were saying, with no substratum. Because, I mean, hylomorphism is, on the one hand, it seems difficult to think in any other way. At least if you want to be able to think that underlying potential, the materiality of things, as what takes on form, which I feel like the form matter relationship is, or the form, form matter, or I'm trying to think of a synonymous distinction. Content and vehicle, maybe. Like it's just so easy to think in those terms, but I resist the idea that we can only think in those terms. But Plotinus's way of doing it by just focusing on like the transition and the diminution or diminishment of light into darkness, which is just the absence of light,
Yep.
feels yeah, I don't know, attractive in some sense. Like I love the idea of the one being unlimited and matter being unlimited, but in different ways, and that we're like caught between these two infinities. I really like that. I just feel like that implies that like the extremes touch in some way.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, that's what you get in Bergson for sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Like that the
Um,
plane of bodies is infinite in its own way, and then that the plane of memory is infinite in its own way.
mm, hmm
And my sense in Bergson is that matter is, well, like I think this was mentioned already, like it's at that limit of duration of spatiality of that past that's always repeating itself. So I guess it's the shortest form of duration that tends towards perfect spatiality but never quite gets there. But it's also, I think he describes it as the resistant for the elan vital.
Mhm.
And so in a sense, it might be kind of what you were saying, Matt, that if what the resistance that the elan vital offers to matter, I mean to the other way around, the resistance
reverse.
that yeah that matter offers to the elan vital in a sense is what allows the elan vital to have to evolve.
Hmm mm,
Why it would need to is an interesting question. Might have to go back and reread some of Creative Evolution. Um, but I mean, it might be that, like you said, without it, it is through that tension with matter that the Elan Vital is forced to evolve, and eventually, the way Bergson puts it is that, I mean, it's a little anthropomorphic, but that he sees man as and especially through the mystic experience, through mysticism, as kind of the consummation of the Elan Vital, which I guess it's the creative impulse finally becomes self-conscious, I guess. And so it's interesting that without matter, perhaps it wouldn't be possible to do that, which then I hear Plotinus again, which it's almost like Bergson's repeating Plotinus and saying that the one wants to contemplate itself, but here it's the Elan Vital wants to become conscious of itself.
hmm
Mhm.
Yeah, I like that.
Mhm.
Um,
I think Bergson kind of has like is equivocal about the way he refers to matter, because sometimes he's like matter is the remotest aspiration of science, like the attempt to turn everything into, you know, instantaneous, perfectly calculated, um, mechanical or deterministic relations, right? And it's just a tendency of the mind in a direction, and matter is nothing more than the ideal point that we can't actually reach, right?
mm,
But then other times it's like he wants to talk about the qualitative richness of movement, or like the plane of movement that, yeah, and talk about it through talking about images within the two or matter and memory, right? And like when he wants to kind of give a robust metaphysical understanding of physical reality, right? And he can't in that instance mean the remotest aspiration of science, which is just this completely spatialized thing. um, so I think he is like equivocal on that, and about how he talks about body, and yeah.
mm. Yeah, there's a point in chapter 3 where Plotinus or Bergson talks about this very special state of mind that's required to grasp matter, what is meant by matter,
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
because you have to place yourself in a state of anoia,
Right.
sympathizing with non-being. And I started to think that that almost has a kind of Buddhist ring to it, if
Yeah.
non-being were to be translated into like emptiness or something,
Yeah.
which is a
That's really
really
interesting. Yep.
interesting way of getting another angle on matter, not as just privation, but actually as the, like when you enter that state of mind to grasp or, intuit the meaning of materiality, that you're actually becoming empty,
Hmm.
you know, um, which I don't know. It's interesting to think of it that way. I don't know what you guys think of that.
Well,
Whether
I think
there's,
it could lend to like a virtual, right, sense
mm,
of emptiness. Like in Nishida, for example, he goes for
mm,
Bergson's pure memory as an emptiness, which is the virtual interconnectedness that is excessive beyond the present, that can't be um, reduced to the present, something like that.
mm. That's kind of the opposite direction and towards pure memory rather than matter.
True. Yeah, yeah.
But if the
But I
opposites
mean, you could say
coincide,
that there is like a virtuality to the rhythm of matter or something like that.
mhm, yeah.
And it's not just within, the organization of matter has form which is immaterial or something like that,
Mm,
which could be like that's true, but also matter has indeterminate potentiality that isn't just a immaterial form of the matter, but is its kind of potential to become something other than itself.
mm, mm, yeah. Did that resonate for you at all, Pedro? Like that special state of mind, sympathizing with non-being, having kind of a Buddhist ring to it, or
I actually wrote next to that on the reading. I was wondering if that's what inspired Bergson's idea of intuition. Um,
uh-huh.
I didn't really think about it from the Buddhist angle in terms of getting insight into matter in terms of anoia, which I assume means like n I guess I've never really thought about how Buddhists think about matter very much. And so I I think what you're saying sounds right to me. I'm just not sure what to I don't think I have an educated opinion.
Yeah. I try to say things in a vague enough way that it's can never be simply right or wrong, but still.
No, in terms of the Buddhist connection, I'm not sure. I didn't think about it that far. I actually
Mm,
approached it more from the perspective of Bergson's intuition.
sure. Yeah. I mean, it seems like there are multiple schools of thought in the history of Buddhism about materiality,
Mm.
but like anything else, it's going to be empty of intrinsic nature. Um, but mind and matter would be empty of intrinsic nature, for the Buddhists. But yeah, I'm thinking of Nietzsche again here, where, he says that something about like there not being a being behind our doing.
Yeah.
The deed is everything. Um, the doer is like a fiction of our grammar or something.
That
Um,
sounds Plotinus like, though,
mm,
to me.
yeah,
In the sense that like the activity in its fullest form is this uh I don't know, the doing, not the a doer or anything
right.
standing outside of it. Yeah, yeah. I don't know if that.
Yeah, well, I like his account or Bergson's account of his account of the logos being a working,
Mm-hmm.
um, that it's a mediating power, I suppose, um, between the idea and nature.
Mm-hmm.
Generative logos spermaticos, or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
uh,
Logoi spermaticoi. Yeah.
logos spermaticoi. Um, because then there's like it helps us resist the idea of substantializing what is really an activity
Mm-hmm.
of endless differentiation from unity, um, that nonetheless remains tied to that unified source, but is, the working is the radiating out into more and more differentiated forms,
Right.
almost like a process of embryogenesis or something.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
For Plotinus, would there be like the idea of Matt, for example? or the idea of Jack or Pedro, as opposed to like Nietzsche saying that there is like
Mm-hmm.
nothing behind it, which I guess would be like more Deleuze's position too, which is
Mm-hmm.
immanence.
Hmm.
Right.
I mean, the Plotinus and Leibnizian kind of, there's like a simple formula, right? Did I mention this example before where you like from Leibniz, where you take a piece of paper, you put a bunch of dots randomly anywhere on the paper, you can make a function that is a curve that touches every point on the paper perfectly. So that's what our monad is in its kind of most monadic, uncomposed form, is a simple formula that expresses like an infinitely complex. You know, with like Fourier transforms, you can like draw any picture with like circles spinning. And so like Leibniz is obsessed with this idea of like compacted information that can just like create infinitely detailed reality. So I think that you could find in Plotinus, or sorry, in Whitehead or Bergson, some appreciation for that inner complexity of expression that makes us unique, that is still somehow in dialogue with the world, and like shifts with the contingencies of the world as it unfolds, rather than like it's all purely contained in there, and each of us contain the entire universe, and like if there were no other souls or no other monads, it would all work exactly the same because I contain the entire universe from my perspective. um,
Right.
I mean, Whitehead like has to do a lot to like explain this. You know, how you go from like monads not having windows to monads having windows. And it's
Right.
like not easy. So
Yeah. 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 I mean, the idea of a living being as a microcosm is something I would want to preserve, but yeah, to avoid that Leibnizian
pre preformed or predetermined. Yeah.
pre-established harmony, yeah,
Yeah.
where nothing actually touches anything else.
Yeah.
Um, we all live in our own private movie theater.
But we all live in each other's movie theater too. That's the crazy thing. I don't know. Leibniz also talks about monadic perception, which is this like weird, I think very Bergsonian idea that like, you know, Husserl says, I see the outside of you, but I can never have your interiority at all. Like I can interpret my perceptions, and that's like the surface level of Husserl. But like the problem of other consciousnesses, right? That Bergson wants to say that like we have monadic perception in the sense that there are perceptions that I have where I'm perceiving that you're an interiority, right? And it's
mhm.
part of my experience that I'm not just experiencing a physical reality, but I'm experiencing like I'm jumping the gap that the physical world places between us.
Yeah.
And I think Kant has this idea, and
Yeah, again,
takes this.
like vision makes us think that we only have access to the surfaces of other
Yeah.
minded
Mhm.
beings, but I don't think that's true
Mhm.
at a deeper level of perception. I think we like real sympathy occurs, and
Mhm.
this problem of other minds is a intellectual problem that we invent.
But see,
Uh,
this is what Leibniz thinks. Like, I mean,
hmm,
he wants to say these things. He's
yeah.
still dedicated to this kind of hardcore determinism with respect to the physical world, and then the kind of dismissiveness, because like our inner life, there's freedom and choice and dignity and all of this, but our bodily life is just a mechanical thing that happens to be in perfect harmony because God made it that way.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's yeah.
Mechanism is a strong drug. It's addictive because it gives, I mean, it's like the power that it grants you to
Yeah.
over nature.
But I
At
mean, I
least
think like, oh
I,
yeah, sorry.
ideally, theoretically, it doesn't tend to work. It hasn't worked out because
Yeah,
I feel
it
like
doesn't happen that way.
the ecological crisis is the
Yeah,
best the strongest evidence you could ask for that the mechanistic understanding of nature is inadequate.
Yeah. I mean, I think that Bergson's like part whole framing of this is like so helpful. And it's interesting that like Leibniz couldn't have taken an approach like this, right? Like when we look at nature in terms of parts, like things cut out from the totality, we can find determinism within that realm. And
Mm-hmm.
even then, we can't perfectly do it, which they did, like Bergson didn't even know that back then, but he suspected it was that way. Um, well, and for Leibniz, it's so interesting because he wants to say like one of the reasons atomism is wrong is like God doesn't work that way. Like God doesn't do building blocks. God does like infinities packed with infinity teeming with life, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
like in the same way that a small, very simple equation creates this infinitely complex image through Fourier transforms and all this kind of stuff. That's the way reality has to work, according to Leibniz. This is like a preferential aesthetic, approach to metaphysics, which is super interesting. But I mean, I think it's the same as Plotinus, that everything is packed with infinity and everything is alive and vibrant and like interconnected and um, dynamic and these kinds of things. So like atomism and determinism and like determinism through atomism, because I would say that like for Spinoza, Leibniz, Plotinus, like determinism isn't fully just like a mechanical determinism. Like they still have these views of sort of emergent order operating with contingency and indeterminacy within the vital sphere, right? Like I think you find that, and within tension within their system, because they still want to be determinists, but they clearly, each one of them delimits a realm that must be understood as having contingencies that evolve creativity and freedom um,
Mm.
it within the vital sphere.
Yeah. Pedro, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the shift that happens, I guess, in the 19th century in mechanics, in mechanistic physics, to a kind of statistical rendering of mechanism, which I've in thermodynamics, but then in like quantum physics as well, where everything becomes about probabilities. But there's like this dispute: is that just our epistemological limits, or is there something about the physical world itself that is indeterministic? Um, do you have any thoughts about like that development in 19th century physics?
I'm on team ontology.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
talk about this with my students. I do tend to think that the probability aspect is ontological. And it's interesting to, I guess as you move away from the wave, well, it's the wave nature of matter is always there. But I guess what happens, my limited understanding of De Broglie's wave theory of matter is that the more decoherence that occurs and the more you get, I guess, complexity is involved as you get into macro scales. Um, that probability just kind of shoots up. I don't know if you ever heard of the Dirac function.
Mhm.
The Dirac function is just basically like one line that shoots up to infinity. So basically, the wave function collapses and it's just that. And so I guess, whereas, your probability distribution for like a single electron is going to be more spread out as you get um, these messier quantum systems, the wave nature of reality never goes away. You have so many events occur in one place that it just has to tend to one result. But yeah, no, I definitely do interpret this as being, as probability being an ontological fact, not just an epistemological fact. I don't buy hidden variable theories of quantum mechanics. I mean, who am I? But it might be because I have the process philosophy commitment to the creative novelty of nature that I
Mhm.
hold this view. But it also just seems more consistent with everything that I know about quantum mechanics, which I guess, yeah, just I guess without it, the whole project of process philosophy of thinking of the world as terms in terms of a creative advance, it kind of goes out the window,
Mhm.
maybe. So I just might be because of that, but it also, I think I have a lot of really educated scientists to back me up. So
Yeah. Do you
yeah.
find when you work with engineering students and physics students that they resist your ontologization of probability, or they're pretty open to it?
No, I spent a whole semester teaching basically a Whiteheadian and Bergsonian philosophy of science. And I made them at the beginning of the semester write what their metaphysics was, ask what is space, what is time. And they all had kind of like the corpuscular kinetic view. What Chapek calls Chapek is basically if you took Bergson and Whitehead and they had a baby and it was a philosopher of science, that's Chapek. And so every ex pretty much everyone at the end of the course that I asked again, now what is your metaphysics? And I didn't even use these words for them, but a few of them were like, I used to see, time as this kind of deterministic thing, but in the world made as like matter as building blocks, but now I see time as just kind of like this living creative advance of nature, and like multiple people said that, and so they really liked it.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
so it was a really cool experiment to do. Yeah, there was actually like no resistance.
Wow,
Uh,
that's great.
yeah.
Nice work.
Yeah, thank you.
Damn,
Thank you.
that's amazing. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, and then earlier, Jack, you were talking about light, which is such an important metaphor for Plotinus, and how it doesn't actually move,
Mm,
which seems like his intuition of that is true on
mm,
like light in physics. It's so mysterious, but
yeah.
it doesn't move except, I mean, I know you can actually take I've seen these very high frame rate um videos of light actually um filling a room or filling a box, and you can actually see the wavefront. Have you guys
Mm,
seen these
Oh,
videos?
that's cool.
And so, but that's like light moving through an already existing medium. But I
mm,
think light in a more cosmological sense is like not moving through already existing air, but actually itself the process of spatiation. It's like
mm, mm,
light or any electromagnetic radiation is actually like what brings forth
mm,
what we think of as space and time rather than simply what just fills it.
mm, mm,
And so light that moves through um, a medium like air down on Earth, which is what these cameras are capturing, maybe behaves differently and appears to us to be to have like wavefronts.
mm,
But in like the primordial sense of what gives rise to space as such, it is coterminous with the radiation of light. Does that make sense at all from a physical point of view, or am I just
I well,
bullshitting?
like I mean, I know that light doesn't electromagnetic radiation doesn't need a medium to propagate. That was like the whole ether problem.
Yeah.
I haven't heard about light, like the expansion of space being due to the expansion of electromagnetic energy. I don't really have anything to say about that. I actually, yeah, I don't, in regarding like the expansion of space, as far as I know, it's supposed to be dark energy that does that, but what the heck is dark energy? I don't know.
Yeah.
Uh,
This
so
is mostly coming from my conversations with Ruth Kastner, she has what's called possibilist transactional interpretation that she's building on Jim Cramer, another physicist who's building on um, Feynman and Wheeler's direct action
mm,
theory, I think it was called. Um, but yeah, the transactional interpretation is one of these attempts to derive space and time from quantum transactions.
cool.
And so she has this whole account. She just published a paper with a colleague who's name I'm blanking on right now, but yeah, they have this account of how actually measurable s- relativistic space-time is brought forth from these quantum transactions, which I find quite compelling. And then they claim in this new paper they can derive, uh, they can understand better the rotational velocity rotational velocity of galaxies, the stars at the edge of galaxies without dark matter, and they can make sense of what appears to be the accelerating expansion of space that dark energy is supposed to explain as an artifact of these quantum transactions. I can share that with you later, but it's not the mainstream understanding, but it's compelling to me as a process thinker, who doesn't only want to think space and time as relative, but also as creatively generated by uh, activities, actual occasions, or quantum transactions in Ruth Kastner's terms. Because you can still get stuck in this view of relativistic space-time as a container or a block that things happen inside of. And I know, Einstein doesn't want to say that, but many, I feel like, our common sense tends in that direction, even though relativistic space-time shouldn't be thought of in that way.
I I mean, I don't really have much to add. I'd love to like see more about the paper. I don't know much about like the physics in terms of like the genesis of space and time. Um, so I don't forget. The first thing was you mentioned space time. And the second thing I wanted to mention, man, mine's gone. But first thing about space time is maybe this is tangential, but thinking space-time in terms of tendencies, because there was a very Tassin video that I watched on general relativity and I had my students watch, and something that I didn't know that I thought was really interesting is that in space-time you technically have to be moving just to be standing still.
Mm.
Um, and so we have the tendency to think that, if I drop this pencil, the pencil's falling, but really it's my table that's coming up to meet the pencil. And the interesting thing about that is that you would think, well, okay, well, like how can that be if my table's coming up to meet the pencil? If we look at the other side of the earth, like directly opposite to me, how is that not coming up too? Well, it's just because space-time is bent differently there. And so I
Hmm.
was just thinking of space-time as a field of tendency, like as maybe the sort of fundamental field of durations that establishes the tendency for where things move in space and time.
Are you
Yeah,
familiar with Mach's
I know the
view of
name,
physics at all?
Ernst Mach.
Because yeah, he was a big influence on um,
Einstein.
Einstein, but I feel like he resists more of these tendencies. Not tendons like the idea of tendencies vibes with what he's talking about. The
Uh-huh.
tendency to spatialize, you know, the to go back to Newton by Einstein, that tendency. Mach fights against that more, and yeah. Anyway,
Hmm.
And I remember the second thing. The second thing that's kind of something I've thought about, random thought, don't know if it has any bearing, but if there's any, in terms of process thinking, if there's any correlation between the continual expansion of memory as time goes by with the expansion of space. But
Mm. Ooh, I love that. Yeah. Hmm.
I don't know if those things tracks. I think the one time I heard someone like theorize that I was like, yes, I think it was Lee Cronin in an interview. Um, he thought, I mean, again, it's all just speculation, and shooting the shit. But I don't know. I've wondered in the past if there's a correlation between the expansion of memory and the expansion of space. And then Cronin was the first person I saw ever mention that. I thought, oh, maybe there's something to it, but I don't know if there's anything on that.
Yeah. I mean, so many things that Cronin says in his whole assembly theory, just it's like begging for a Bergsonian or Whiteheadian or process reading. And I've tried to get his attention on the website formerly known as Twitter. Um, but I haven't succeeded. I mean, I did, but he's kind of combative. He's hard to dialogue with, but assembly theory is really interesting precisely for the reasons you're kind of pointing out. Um, and it makes me think of the most enigmatic part of Whitehead, which is not disconnected or unrelated from some questions you've been asking me, Pedro, about eternal objects and how they relate to um, actual occasions and history and whether they change in any way. And um, Whitehead says that as the past grows, and for him, like Bergson, the past is like indestructible. It's like all there. Um, and as memory grows, it's Whitehead says, casting the shadow. Well, his students record him as saying this, casting the shadow of truth back upon the eternal realm and enriching it. Right. And so, um, what becomes past for us, because the past is indestructible, in a sense, is now eternal, or objectively immortal in his terms. And so that means that eternity itself is growing, right?
Yeah.
And this is taking time seriously, not in an ontological sense, not as metrical time that clocks measure, but time as duration that becomes memory, and is constantly swelling as the present advances. And so clearly, from a process point of view, like what's ontologically primary is going to be memory and this creative advance, not space and time as we geometrically um, construe them in our models.
Yeah.
Right.
I think there's another big connection with light, as you've been talking about it, and all of this with kind of topological geometry, and like Leibniz being someone who thinks through this really early. That's like fully Plotinian about the ideas, where like, a triangle, through whatever transformations, it could be perspective, just changing the perspective on a triangle gives you all possible triangles, right? So the same triangle through transformations of perspective can be every triangle. And then you can think of like the virtual absolute survey of the triangle, which is no perspective, but all the perspectives at once. Like that's kind of what light is in a way. It's the same photon expressing itself through an infinity of perspectives by going everywhere, right? You hear people in physics talk about it that way.
Yeah.
And yeah, you could think the soul is also doing this, right? It's like an infinitely twisted and topologically transformed unity. And there's no two instances of its transformation that are the same, like ideally or like theoretically or whatever. And it produces an infinite amount of content.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. It's a helpful reminder that the forms are not, or the ideas are not static. They're infinitely dynamic in a sense, because like the form of the triangle is sort of moving at infinite speed through all the permutations of those three lines in relation to each other.
I think the problem is when you like assume that God contemplates it in stasis as like something unchanged. Like when you get to that idea of like the infinite intellect, where all the ideas are present to the mind of God in their stasis, or in their like, I don't know. And like, does it help to just say they're virtual and not actualized? Like, I don't know. Maybe it does. And I think that's kind of what Whitehead's doing with the eternal objects, right? They kind of have this non-actual, non-atomized, like infinite potential to be related to anything else. And it's kind of all those potentials at once, but not actualized. Like,
yeah. Yeah. And there's a very similar, like concrescence is, I think, intentionally analogous, meant to be analogous to like quantum decoherence in a sense. Like the the process of concrescence has to eliminate incompatible eternal objects so that something definite or determinate, actual determinate can arise. And that's a logical, but also a ontological process. Was that Leibnizian term, incompossible?
Yeah.
Is that the word?
Incompossible. Yeah, exactly. But
Which,
like,
can you explain what that means? Is
well,
it
like,
related to what
yeah,
I'm
I mean,
describing?
it's, these things can just not be together, right? Like,
Yeah.
if I put poison in my, but this is the example from Spinoza where he kind of gets the idea, but like, if I put poison in my body, it can't the potentialities cannot coexist.
Right.
So it's looking at the level of possibility. So I don't know. There are certain possibilities that are eliminated if we're playing music and like one of us is playing in a different key and the other of us. So we have to like limit those possibilities in order for harmony to be produced within the music or something like that.
Right. Yeah. So you can't have a square circle, for example.
But for Whitehead, there's this kind of perspectival fudgeability. Is fungibility the right word? I don't even know if I'm using that
Fudgeability or
right.
fungibility?
Like that you can fudge the
Fudgeability.
the result or something, right? So like my monadic perspective can like have incompatibilities with another one without breakdown of the entire universe. So he kind of
Yeah.
eliminates
Oh, yeah.
that central kernel of the physical world for Leibniz, and for I think as well the world soul for Plotinus.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Whitehead says contemporary actual occasions occur in causal independence of one
Exactly.
another, which just follows from his principle of relativity, which is a
Yeah.
generalization of relativistic physics.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, compatibility will need to be established by whatever occasion arises that includes both of those
Yeah,
incompatibles.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
that opens a lot of space for like weird stuff to happen that's non-deterministic.
Yeah.
Sorry, Pedro. Yeah.
no, you're good. There's a lot of affinity between all these thinkers. Just made me think about Nietzsche, which in kind of a tangential way, but one thing I never forgot, which he also kind of gets from Spinoza, is that Nietzsche talks about knowledge as a way that different drives learn to coexist with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that's his definition of knowledge is almost a
Mm.
finding of justice or equilibrium between different drives
Mm-hmm.
in a person. All these drives want to dominate, but knowledge is achieved when they all learn to coexist
Mm-hmm.
in harmony.
In a way, that's like Leibnizian perception, because like we have an infinite number of perceptions at every moment, and like some of them are clumping together and composing into clear, coherent, apperceptive consciousness, and some aren't. And like when you hear a sound that gradually catches your attention, there's a point when there's like micro perceptions that haven't become full blown perceptions, right? And so you kind of have this need at every moment that consciousness is basically trying to bring as much intensity out of the perceived data as possible, which necessarily means like eliminating certain micro perceptions and allowing others to emerge into full perception.
Mm. Yeah.
And for Leibniz, perceptions are tendencies, right? They're like an inner appetitive force within our soul monad.
Mm. It's funny. This is just a silly, playful connection, but Pedro, you keep apologizing for tangents, which I don't think are really tangents, but just makes me think of the way a perfect circle is composed of infinitely many tangents. It's, it's all good. It all comes back around in the end. And that's related to this incompossibility thing too. The way that difference can still be forged into identity.
One thing that I left out, which is another tangent, which I guess is a good thing. Something to think about, which I forgot to mention, but in terms of will to power, we were talking about how is it different? Is Deleuze and Nietzsche, there's just pure immanence, and Plotinus, I think there's still a sort of Platonism. But the
Mm,
way Heidegger puts it in his book on Nietzsche is that Nietzsche collapses the distinction between dunamis and energeia.
Mm.
And
mm,
I don't know what that says about matter,
Interesting.
uh,
mm.
but I don't know. I just wanted to throw that out there and see what you'll make of that.
I never thought of Nietzsche as doing that, but if that's true, then I mean, I don't like that. I feel like we need that polarity to account for creativity. Um,
I mean, this is Heidegger. I don't think it's Nietzsche saying this. This is what Heidegger
Mm.
says that Nietzsche does with his will to power.
yeah, I'll have
That's
to
interesting.
dig more into that.
I
Uh,
mean, for like Leibniz, you have living force and dead force, right? So like, and this is very similar to Bergson. Like, I have all these memories attempting to actualize themselves, and in some sense, they're dunamis, not energeia, right? They're potentials. I mean, you might say that they're entelecheia instead of dunamis, which that would be another question. But and you have like forces that are vying to actualize themselves. We can think of drives, even unconscious drives, and so then we would need a distinction, obviously, between dunamis or potential and activity, actualization. But I guess for Nietzsche, I don't know, power. I mean, I'm thinking through Spinoza partially, but like power is virtue, and virtue must be actualized. I don't know, something like that maybe would. I mean, the Schopenhauerian idea of like a plenum of forces might be also, and then like the emphasis on the body, that the body is like an actualized force of intensity
yeah,
rather than like something potential. I don't know.
I
I
mean,
I,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I need to go back and reread. It's been a minute, but I thought about it as getting rid of teleology,
Hmm.
as there is no separation between the force or drive and its fulfillment.
Okay. Yeah.
Deleuze puts it in his book on Nietzsche that at every moment, um, like the forces are always coming together and clashing, and their arithmetical difference is always being determined and sorted. And so in that sense, um,
Hmm.
yeah, I guess I just always interpreted that as the getting rid of teleology.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like
Right.
the way Deleuze puts it is that these forces are drawing their consequences. Like the clash of forces is the consequence of this is being drawn at every moment.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, there's thinking of eternal recurrence and that anti-teleological flavor of Nietzsche's thought, and I was like, okay, I see what Heidegger's saying there. Um, and I think that there are many parallels in Nietzsche with um, his late writing on the will to power and his perspectivalism, parallels to Whitehead. Um, but it's like I guess that what Nietzsche is trying to say is that the difference between the potential and the actual is perspectival. It like depends like what's potential from the perspective of one uh being, one body, if you want, is actual for another from another perspective, right? So there's no um perspective independent difference.
Hmm.
And I guess that's an important insight, but I would still want to resuscitate teleology in some way, not as an end that is distinct from the means, um, which would thereby devalue the means in some sense, but still understand like cosmogenesis and evolution as as aiming at uh, beauty, aiming at intensity. I don't want to let go of aims, and I know Nietzsche's not letting go of aims too. And so maybe it's just a particular form of teleology that places the end outside of becoming rather than always present in each moment of becoming. The end is achieved, which I think is what Whitehead's doing with concrescence. Um, but Whitehead still has God, which does, in a way, reinstitute a kind of cosmic telos, you
Yeah.
know? which he affirms is a tragic, not triumphalist. Like God makes everything okay in the end. No, the highest form of beauty is tragic beauty in Whitehead. So he read Nietzsche. He's got there's a copy of Will to Power that was in Whitehead's library that's all marked up, and um,
That's cool.
so he was trying to include Nietzsche's insights, but I think also preserve some of what Nietzsche maybe brashly rushed past.
Yeah, and I think that's my qualm with Nietzsche is I tend to lean more towards that what you said, like preserving these aims. I feel intuitively that that's right. But then I read Nietzsche and I'm like, damn, you're so much smarter than me. Maybe.
You said that so well, damn it.
What am I not seeing?
Yeah. It's good to have Nietzsche as a gadfly for sure.
Yeah,
I
Mhm.
think I mentioned this guy Goyo last time. Did I mention him?
I don't remember at
He
least.
was one of the like Nietzsche inspirations. There was like a French spiritualist, moral philosopher. Nietzsche says he's a free thinker, but not a free spirit. Anyway, he's really interesting, and he like has extremely like Nietzschean flavor, but it's also like Bergsonian, proto Bergsonian, I would say, like kind of. And he talks about like obligation, so it's feels really closely connected to the two sources of morality. Um, but he has like, I don't know, a robust way of taking. You might think kind of like a will to power,
Mhm.
dynamic Leibnizian kind of approach to all of these things, and yet doesn't go all the way to Nietzsche. And
Mhm.
I don't know, for instance, like we gain a sense of obligation through developing our powers and capacities and actions. So like as you know, I don't know, become a musician or a painter or something like that, and you see yourself succeeding at it, it creates like a calling, right? And it creates a sense of obligation to fulfill the potential within you. So it's like very much based in this sense of dynamics and movement and uh yeah, and the idea of obligation obviously is huge for Bergson, um, in understanding value. Um,
Mhm.
so
Right.
definitely worth checking out. There's English
yeah.
translations too.
Goyo, you said?
It's like Guyau.
Hmm. It's a new name for me.
Yeah, let me show you.
Hmm. Um, I have a couple more minutes. I have a applicant I need to interview at 2.
Me too. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I did have one more thought I wanted to, unless you were about to say something.
No, go ahead.
Um, this idea of like a thought without image, or for Plotinus, some kind of intellectual, psychical, spiritual activity that isn't, and that involves something like thought or like insight or intuition or whatever, but isn't connected to an image and doesn't have a representation or something determinate and finite within it. So
Hmm?
Plotinus cracks into this and like suggests this, and Bergson draws this out. It's one of the really interesting things I think in this. And Matt, I've brought this up a number of times, kind of like devaluing consciousness with
Hmm.
respect to like other forms of thinking.
Hmm.
We actually find, I'll just really quick give an overview of this, but like we find this in Leibniz and in Bergson in different ways that I think are really interesting. I mean, one, we can just think like in the attempt to describe duration, Bergson like searches after images that are going to help us express it, right? And
Hmm.
there's this thinking that's involved in inventing images, and 1,000 images could speak for this. Obviously, some do it better, and so the task is to find the witty, efficient ones that do it quickly,
Hmm.
and with the least problems or something like that. Um, and Leibniz actually wants to do this in geometry in this really weird way where instead of like proving that a circle is what it is by using a compass or by doing any of these things in geometric space, he wants to create a way of making proofs that entirely rely on mechanisms or relations or whatever you want to call it that are non-spatial. So the
Isn't that
way of
like what
doing it,
Descartes does with analytic geometry?
in a way, it's going beyond that though. I'm not going to probably be able to give the best voice to it, but in a way, the goal is to not rely at all on the imagination or on diagrams or anything like that to do to do geometry, which is very strange. But like, I mean, this is similar to like Turing and stuff, where like
Mm.
any geometrical operation could be turned into a machine that does
Mm.
basically an isomorphic thing, but what it spits out at the end is like a physical process rather than like an idea or something like that, right? So this idea that we can transpose a certain thought into a completely different mechanism, like into a machine, or that we could turn it into, like, there would be an entire new mathematics of geometry that would be thought of in completely different ways, but would say the same thing as the geometry that we use in space. And I mean, that's a very like cerebral kind of intellect forward way of approaching this, but I think that it really gets at the same idea, which is like, how can we think purely in terms of the virtual? And really quick, just Bergson talks a couple times about chess players, and it was like a big debate at the time, like how do we how do like expert chess players like think about the game. And he says that they basically, I'll spare all the details of the whole debate and everything, but he says that they have a sense of the power and the qualitative unfolding of the duration of the pieces. So they don't spatially represent the board to themselves. They have a sense of all the moves. And he says, like, one of the chess players said something like, a rook is a power of going straight ahead, and a bishop is an oblique force or whatever. So like they feel the qualitative relation of forces. And then what they do is they can be playing 6 games at once. When they move in their head to think about the next game, they play the entire game in like 2 seconds in their head up to that point. And then they play 50 possible games from that point. And none of that happens with an image. Or if the image comes up, it's kind of hazy, or it's like the potential to actualize the image, but not necessarily doing so.
Does image imply consciousness in Bergson?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm just obviously thinking about AI in this context, which, one of the things they got really good at initially was chess and Go and these games. But it seems to me that the brute force computation is doing something very different than what a
Exactly.
human chess master is doing, feeling the moves as these powers that each piece has versus literally calculating all of the probabilities out, however many moves the computer has memory to compute.
Yeah.
Though I'm remembering that that was the old architecture for the original chess playing computers, and like the new form is using the transformer architecture of like machine learning and stuff, which they don't even know how it's
Right.
how it's working.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what's going on there.
No, I think that that's a good parallel though, because I think it is actualizing all these things in a way that the chess player doesn't. Right? They don't have to do this, and I think like when a musician is jamming, they can like predict, or not predict, but they can envision multiple possible paths that they would take in sound without having to like auditorily represent them to themselves. They feel the virtual potentiality to go in like different directions. And so I think that like we're doing non-representational thinking like all the time, and we just don't really notice it. And like Bergson points out that there's a lot of things that we think we need images, and even like we think that we make images when we actually don't within our head. So like uh a word, like, I don't know, silver, something with like more than 5 letters. It's like try and picture the word as if it's written on a piece of paper. It's actually like almost impossible for most people, even visualizers, to do without saying the word, hearing it in our inner voice, articulating it somehow, or even like having sensations related to writing or typing or something like that. Like picture it without saying the words, see all the letters. Like, are you sure that you see all the letters? Or do you have to like
I can
scan
do
it
it,
and
I think.
I could definitely picture words, but I can't do it without like silently hearing it.
yeah. Yeah, yeah.
I don't know how it's going for you, Pedro, but
I mean, yeah, there's always the like I think it's vocalized, but like I have this yellow piece of paper right here and I look up and I think I can see it. Yeah, I think I can see it. But I do like kind of have, I guess, sections, but
I mean, there's varying degrees of like how well people can create images. And like Bergson actually goes into this whole debate that happened with William James and some other people where some guy was like, imagine the breakfast that you had this morning and imagine the room and like all of this and like hold it in your memory. And like half the people couldn't do it, but they could perfectly describe what was there and what they had. But they said, I don't have an image. So there are clearly like some people who have these images and some people who don't.
yeah.
But um, you don't need it in order to think the thing. And I think I have a very active inner imagination. Like I can do pretty well. Words are harder for me, especially big words. Like when I'm like, if I tried to look at phenomenology, I would have to like say the letters or something like that. Like there's no way for me to know when I'm imagining the whole word that it actually has the letters that it should have, unless I use these other synesthetic synergies, speaking, acting, like pretending I'm writing. If I'm trying to say a word to someone, I actually pretend like when I was like Gaio earlier, I was like Guy, like then it's perfectly easy for me, you know. But the image. So anyway, very roundabout way of saying like there's a lot going on at the edge of consciousness that doesn't involve representation, and like I think that this is the fertile area of virtual psychology if we want to avoid the kind of unconscious of Freud, something very similar to that, but from a different tradition, tendencies, these kinds of quasi at the edge of conscious.
It's very Jungian too. I mean,
Yeah.
Jung would talk about the difference between the archetype and the archetypal image. We only ever have access to the image, the archetypal image, but behind that, that we participate in, but yet can't actually image fully
Yeah,
for
exactly.
ourselves would be the archetype.
Yeah.
So it's important. I'm totally a devotee of non or anti even representational accounts of cognition and consciousness, pre-consciousness, unconsciousness, super
Super
consciousness.
conscious.
Representation is a very small slice. I don't deny that we do have representation as a capacity, but I think it's like a very narrow slice of what thinking is.
Yeah.
so I guess before y'all go, a quick question, Jack, what do you want to do moving forward and how can we best assist you with that?
Good question. I mean, definitely uh editing thing, like as you read through it, marking any editing errors that need to be
Okay.
addressed,
Can you
or
share
even
the
like
original French with us too?
definitely, yeah.
There's some
I have
keywords that
that
I'm
somewhere. I
curious.
think I can find it. Actually, let me just do that right now because otherwise I'm gonna. There's no reason to put this on. Okay, I can just drop it in the chat.
And so the idea is to like write extended introduction that goes more into the ideas themselves, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and improve the translation as well.
Okay. So improved translation. And in terms of the extended introduction, I guess should we have another meeting to talk about like what you want to see in it? Is it like do you want it like specifically for the ideas here? You also mentioned talking about like including Schelling, for example, or other thinkers.
I mean, I guess I would see like maybe 2 or 3 sections. One is like summary of the book and like unpacking the ideas in conjunction with the other lectures. right?
Okay.
And kind of like connecting the ideas in that sense, and maybe connecting, and then yeah, well, I guess that would be one, like unpacking the Leibniz, or sorry, the Plotinus dimension of things, and just being
Okay.
trying to be true to like Bergson and his reading of Plotinus. Then maybe a section on like Bergson and the influence and tension and the way that Bergson kind of rejects things in Plotinus, and kind of get into the more how does that relation
Bergson's buggery of Plotinus,
Yes, I
basically.
guess how
uses and
Plotinus.
abuses and of Plotinus, and
Sure.
then kind of Plotinus in 20th century process and whatever you call Deleuze.
I'd call them process.
Yeah, and maybe even like now I'm thinking about it, like I could do something with um Merleau-Ponty, who I also think is like
Hmm.
very influenced by these ideas, especially through Leibniz.
I'd love to talk to you about that. I'm teaching a grad phenomenology course in the
Nice.
fall, and I intend to focus mostly on Merleau-Ponty.
Oh, amazing.
And I've read a pretty good chunk of the phenomenology of perception, but it was a little bit ago. But it's probably what I'm gonna do most. So I
Yeah,
would love
I'm
to
teaching that in the
talk.
fall too, actually. So
Oh, cool. Yeah,
yeah,
we should like exchange notes
definitely.
and talk
Yeah,
about that. Yeah,
yeah,
and I
yeah.
mean, if you wanted to, I'd also be happy. Even in my dissertation, I've written comparative sections on Nietzsche and Bergson. I don't know if that's
Mm-hmm,
something you would
mm-hmm.
want,
Yeah,
but
yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, on the Plotinus threads and everything like that. But I think
ooh,
like
yeah,
this kind of like the philosophy of life and the dynamic kind of will to power, depth of bodies being, forces and all of this kind of thing. Yeah,
yeah,
that would be a solid area to compare, because I think that's the shared theme.
sure. So like a list of thinkers, I don't know, Nietzsche or like Schelling,
Yeah,
uh,
and some of those could be,
Deleuze.
kind of quicker, and others could be like 10 pages long or something like that. I don't know. I mean, we have whatever freedom with this we want.
Yeah,
Cool.
that's awesome.
Um, yeah, so maybe I do like the idea of us reading the book together in a meeting. So we could do that one. We could try that again. We could try again to do that next time.
Mm. Like
Like read
going,
the whole thing in one go.
It doesn't have to be like that. It could just be a chapter or something like that. I mean, definitely more the like complexer ones where we want to like make sure that we all know what every sentence means and like do some of the editing there, especially
yeah,
the more, yeah,
want to do a legit translation. That's what you
yeah,
do, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and I haven't
We could
read.
just try 3, because I think it really starts getting juicy at 3, and the earlier ones are a bit more kind of just like setting the stage. But
I haven't read too much of the Ennead, so I should probably also.
mm,
I should probably like. Yeah, that's probably something I should do too. That's probably gonna take a little bit more time, but I'm happy to do it.
yeah, I've been going through them.
I got super excited because a friend of mine has a an old 5 volume set of the Enneads. It's the translation by Stephen McKenna,
Okay,
which
yeah.
is considered like more spiritual
Right.
than the
Yeah,
more
yeah.
recent translations. Um, and it's like printed on that old rag paper. It's a limited
Mhm.
edition, 1,000 copies. And he just sent me an email like, "Do you know anyone who might want this?" And I was like, "I might. I have some friends who are into Plotinus." And he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm only asking 2,500 for the 5 volumes." And I'm like, "Oh, I don't know how much he paid for them, but
Oh
Oh
I
my
my
guess
God.
there are only 1,000 copies of that particular edition."
Whoa, that's
So
crazy.
um, don't know if either of you are interested at this point in your careers, but
I don't know if I'm
God.
that interested in anything.
That's a month of rent.
yeah. So maybe if it was signed by Plotinus, I'd go for it. But
Yeah.
yeah. Anyways,
Well, I had one last thought I wanted to say, because earlier I was mentioning like Leibniz against atomism, because like God doesn't just play with building blocks. He's like infinities packed with infinities, like this kind of idea. I think that like Plotinus at one point says, my entire goal in philosophy was to find what's divine in me and connect it to what's divine in the
oh,
universe.
that is exactly what Steiner says that anthroposophy is, and so I didn't realize he was totally just lifting it straight from Plotinus.
That
But
was
That's a Plotinus
those were his dying words.
They're Plotinus's dying words?
I think so, yeah.
That's even more badass. I love the like last word kind of.
nice.
Yeah, that's
Thinking
like
last
that
words.
he just summed up the whole point of life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think like, yeah, that's where, I mean, we've been talking like there's an effort to balance Plato and Aristotle, and like an effort to like update ancient Greek philosophy based on Stoicism and Gnosticism and Christianity, all this, blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, the true impulse, and Bergson gets at this, is like to go back to the source, and the source is the soul and the divine, and right, and it's to gain this mystical experience, and then of the divinity within us and its connection to the divinity in the universe, and to then update basically all of philosophy, well, of Greek philosophy based on that. So
That's our job now.
true. I mean, it is.
Right. I like that framing, Pedro.
We could put that at the beginning. Like, our effort with this book is ultimately to find what is divine within us and connect it to what's divine in the universe.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So if it does that, then it succieds, and if it doesn't, then be
Oh.
damned.
Try again next
We'll
lifetime.
try again. I like that. Well, somebody make a note of that as the
Noted. Yeah, it's noted in the transcript.
True. We should also, like, I don't know, Matt, sometimes you feed transcripts to chat GPT and stuff like that. I don't know, getting summaries of what we've already talked about, or like outlines of it, and then like having a kind of brainstorming or I guess workshopping meeting where we synthesize that would be.
Yeah, I can share some
Or
summaries.
doesn't even Zoom do that with
Yeah.
its like AI? Yeah. So it'd be cool to have those kind of skeletons, and then we can fill in details and think about like architectonic structuring of the
definitely.
So,
all right, guys, I gotta run do this
Yeah, me
interview. Really enjoyed this, and I'll like cut out some part of
in the beginning.
Yeah, cut out the beginning.
Talk about the
cool
publishing and everything.
Cool.
All right. See you guys soon.
And then we'll email each other about the next meeting, but we'll shoot for like mid-June.
That works.
Sweet.
All right.
Be well. This is great. Get some sleep, Pedro.
I'm about to sleep with my dog. Yeah.
See you guys.
Cheers.